It was around 2 a.m. when Callie woke up to a soft creaking sound coming from downstairs. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, her heart slowly picking up pace. Maybe it was the wind. The house was old, and the floors always creaked. She lived alone, though sometimes her best friend Maya would drop by late at night. Maya had a spare key for emergencies, and it wouldn't have been the first time she let herself in without warning. But tonight felt different. The creaking had stopped, replaced by the soft hum of the TV turning on. Callie sat up, blinking groggily. Was Maya here? She glanced at her phone on the nightstand. No missed calls or texts. Still, she shrugged it off, thinking Maya might have just stopped by unannounced again. But something nagged at her as she swung her legs over the bed. Maya was always loud when she came in, talking to herself, singing, or calling Callie's name. Tonight, there was only silence, except for the faint noise from downstairs. Curiosity and unease pushed her out of bed. Callie tiptoed down the narrow hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. As she descended the stairs, the dim light from the TV flickered across the walls of her living room. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. There, sitting casually on her couch, was a man. He wasn't Maya, and he certainly wasn't anyone she recognized. He was middle-aged, with dark hair that fell messily over his forehead, wearing an old, oversized hoodie. His legs were propped up on her coffee table as if he belonged there. He turned his head slowly towards her, meeting her eyes with a chilling calmness. "Hey there," he said, smiling. The smile didn't reach his eyes. It was cold, as if rehearsed. He lifted a hand and waved at her like they were old friends. Callie's heart lurched into her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She stared at the man, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Had she somehow left the door unlocked? Was this some kind of prank? The man patted the empty space on the couch beside him. "Why don't you sit down?" he asked, still smiling, his voice too casual, too relaxed for the situation. Callie snapped out of her frozen state. Her blood turned to ice as panic surged through her. She turned and bolted for the front door, her feet pounding against the floor. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as she yanked the door open and ran outside, barefoot and trembling. The cold night air hit her face, but she didn't stop running. She sprinted across the street to her neighbor's house, pounding on the door frantically. "Please, help me. There's someone in my house," she cried, tears streaming down her face. The neighbor, Mrs. Fields, an elderly woman who had always been kind to Callie, opened the door, her eyes wide with concern. "What's going on, dear?" Callie was barely able to explain, her words tumbling over each other in a rush. Mrs. Fields immediately called the police while trying to calm her down, but Callie couldn't stop shaking. The image of that man's smile, his eerie calmness, replayed over and over in her head. The police arrived within minutes, storming into her house. Callie waited outside, watching the flashing red and blue lights, her heart still hammering in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers came out, shaking his head. "There's no one in the house," he said. "We've checked every room." Callie's stomach dropped. "But I saw him. He was sitting right there." The officer nodded, his expression serious. "The front door was locked when we arrived. No sign of forced entry. But we did find evidence that someone had been in your house recently. Looks like he picked the lock. We'll need to take a closer look." Later that night, Callie learned the terrifying truth. The man had likely been watching her for some time. There were small signs she hadn't noticed before. Windows that had been slightly cracked open, doors unlocked when she was sure she'd locked them, and the feeling she sometimes had that someone was watching her. The officers told her that the man had likely slipped away the moment she ran out of the house, but the knowledge didn't bring her any comfort. She could still picture his face, that unnerving smile, the way he had waved her over as if they were friends. That night, Callie didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, sent waves of fear through her. She kept replaying the scene in her head, wondering how long he had been watching, and whether he might come back. From that day on, she never felt truly safe in her own home again. Tyrese had taken the job as a DoorDash driver a few months ago to make some extra money. He didn't mind the late-night deliveries. It gave him time to think, and the quiet streets felt peaceful. But that Wednesday night, something felt off from the moment his phone buzzed with a new order. It was nearly midnight, and the delivery location was an office building he had never seen before. The name on the order was just Mr. Harper. Harper, and the instructions were unusually detailed. Leave the food inside the building, on the second floor, by the door marked 206. As Therese approached the office building, he noticed it was completely dark except for a single light flickering near the front door. The street was empty, and there were no other cars parked nearby. He hesitated for a moment, staring up at the tall, shadowy building. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. With a sigh, Tyrese stepped out of his car, grabbing the food from the passenger seat. The cool night air sent a shiver down his spine, but he shook it off. It's just another delivery, he thought. He wasn't scared of some old building. He approached the glass doors and pushed them open with a creak. Inside, the building was eerily silent. There was no reception desk, no chairs, just a wide, empty hallway and a staircase leading up into darkness. "Come on, man," Tyrese muttered to himself, holding the bag of food tighter. He stared at the staircase, trying to summon the courage to walk up into the pitch black. Then he remembered the order. Second floor, door 206. Why hadn't they left the light on upstairs? Just as he was about to take a step toward the stairs, he heard a sound. A door creaked open to his right, and a man stepped out from a dimly lit room. Tyrese froze. The man was tall, with a gaunt face and dark eyes. He said nothing, just pointed toward the stairs. "Upstairs, right?" Tyrese asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice wavered. The man didn't reply. He just kept pointing. Tyrese felt a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "I'll just leave it here," Tyrese said quickly, deciding then and there he wasn't going upstairs. He placed the food on the ground floor, near the entrance. "I'm sure they'll find it." He gave a nervous smile, though the man didn't move. His eyes followed Tyrese's every step as he backed away from the food and toward the exit. The moment Tyrese stepped out of the building, he felt a wave of relief. The air outside was cool and fresh compared to the suffocating darkness inside. He hurried back to his car, his heart racing. As he drove off, he couldn't shake the image of the man standing silently, pointing toward the stairs. That night, Tyrese barely slept. His mind kept replaying the scene over and over. Something had felt so wrong about that place. Why had the man not spoken? Why was the building so dark? And why had he been so insistent about the stairs? The next day, Tyrese was woken by a phone call. It was the police. "Mr. Carter?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yeah, that's me. We're calling about the delivery you made last night. We need to ask you a few questions." Tyrese's heart sank. "Is everything okay?" The officer hesitated before continuing. "There was a break-in at the building you delivered to. The security cameras caught some suspicious activity around the time you were there." Tyrese sat up in bed, a chill running through him. "Suspicious how?" "The CCTV footage shows two men waiting upstairs, near the door you were supposed to deliver to," the officer said. "It looks like they were expecting someone. Possibly you." Tyrese felt his blood run cold. The man who had pointed toward the stairs flashed through his mind. "What about the guy downstairs? The one who pointed me toward the stairs?" he asked, his voice trembling. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We didn't see anyone downstairs in the footage," the officer said finally. "The cameras don't show anyone on the ground floor except you." Tyrese's heart pounded in his chest. "But I saw him," he whispered. "He was right there." "Whoever it was," the officer said gravely, "it looks like they wanted you to go upstairs." Tyrese hung up the phone, his hand shaking. He realized how close he had come to walking into something terrible that night. If he had gone up those stairs, it might have been a very different story. As the weight of it all sunk in, Tyrese made a silent vow. No more late-night deliveries. Some things just weren't worth the money. I always preferred the solitude of nature, the quiet serenity of camping far away from the noise of the city. So when I found a remote lake deep in the forest, I knew it was perfect. The water was still, the trees whispered in the breeze, and not a soul was in sight. After setting up my tent and cracking open a beer, I let the calmness of the evening settle in. The sun was just beginning to set when I heard footsteps approaching. Turning around, I saw a man walking toward me, a friendly smile on his face. He looked like he was in his late 30s, with a worn-out baseball cap and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding toward the extra camp chair I had set up. "Sure, why not?" I replied, feeling the need for some company after a long day alone. We introduced ourselves, but I couldn't remember his name after that. Something like Roy or Finn. It didn't really matter. He was just another camper passing through. We talked about the usual stuff, the best fishing spots, the challenge of finding good trails, and how the stars looked so much clearer out here. He pulled a couple of beers from his bag, and we clinked bottles as the sky turned darker, the stars emerging one by one. After a while, he leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "You know, there's this incredible view not far from here. You can see the whole valley and the lake, all lit up by the moon. It's breathtaking." Something in the way he said it made me uneasy. I had already scouted the area earlier, and I hadn't seen anything that hinted at a lookout point nearby. But he was insistent, leaning closer, almost whispering, "It's not far. We can head out in a bit, once it's completely dark. Trust me, it's worth the walk." I hesitated, my gut telling me to say no, but then I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. He seemed friendly enough, and the idea of a hidden view sounded intriguing. After all, wasn't this part of the adventure? "All right," I said, my voice not quite as confident as I wanted it to be. "Let's check it out." We extinguished the fire and headed into the woods, guided by the faint light of our flashlights. The trees pressed in on all sides, and the deeper we went, the more uneasy I became. The trail was rough, barely there at all, as if it hadn't been used in years. I tried making small talk, but my companion was unusually quiet, his earlier warmth replaced by a strange detachment. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing. There, nestled among the trees, was an old, decrepit RV. Its roof was caved in, covered in moss, and the windows were broken, glass shards reflecting the moonlight. "This is the view?" I asked, my voice tight with disappointment and confusion. He didn't answer, just stared at the RV, his face unreadable. My skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation that something was very wrong. That's when I noticed the second man. He stepped out of the shadows, tall and lanky, his eyes dark hollows in the night. He stood by the RV, silent, watching us. My heart leaped into my throat. This was no coincidence. I'd been led here on purpose. Before I could think, my legs moved on their own. I bolted into the woods, my breath ragged, branches slashing at my face as I ran blindly through the darkness. Behind me, I heard them shouting, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, hoping, praying that I could outrun them. The forest seemed endless, every tree a looming shadow, every rustle a threat. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded, and I found myself back at the lake, my campsite within sight. But when I stumbled into the clearing, panting and terrified, everything was gone. My tent, my bag, even the fire pit. All of it had disappeared, as if I'd never been there at all. I spent the night in my car, too scared to return to the woods. The next day, I drove straight to the nearest town and reported what happened to the local police. They searched the area but found nothing. No RV, no strangers, no sign of my campsite. It was like the night had swallowed everything whole. The officers assured me that people often get spooked in the woods, but I knew what I saw. I knew what had happened. And I knew that somewhere out there, those men were still waiting for the next camper to fall into their trap. Reed had been looking forward to a quiet getaway. The Airbnb he found online seemed perfect. A small, cozy house tucked away in a secluded neighborhood far from the hustle and bustle of city life. It was just what he needed after a hectic few months at work. The house sat at the end of a narrow street lined with tall, old trees. It was almost dusk when he pulled into the driveway, the last light of the day casting long shadows over the road. He got out of his car, stretched, and breathed in the crisp, cool air. He could hear nothing but the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. After unpacking his bags and settling in, Reed stood by the front window, sipping his coffee, enjoying the stillness. But that tranquility was shattered when he noticed a man walking slowly down the street. The man was in his late 40s, with disheveled hair and wearing a dark hoodie. He wasn't just walking though, he seemed to be staring directly at Reed's rental house. Reed tensed up. For a moment their eyes met, and the man gave a slight, unsettling smile before continuing his slow pace down the street. Reed's stomach churned with unease. Was it just coincidence? A neighbor out for a walk? But something about the way the man stared didn't feel right. Reed tried to brush off the encounter, though the image of the man's hollow smile lingered in his mind. By the time night fell, he was feeling restless. He double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, hoping a good night's sleep would ease his nerves. Sometime around 4 a.m., Reed was jolted awake. His heart was pounding, though he couldn't remember what had disturbed him. Groggy and disoriented, he sat up in bed and listened. That's when he saw it. An eerie, pale light seeping from under the bedroom door, coming from the living room. His pulse quickened. The light hadn't been on when he went to bed. He had turned everything off, or at least he thought he had. Reed crept out of bed, the wooden floor cold beneath his bare feet, and moved quietly toward the living room. As he rounded the corner, his breath caught in his throat. Standing in the middle of the room, going through his belongings, was the same man from earlier, the one with the hoodie. The man hadn't noticed Reed yet, but when he did, his head snapped up, and their eyes locked. A sinister grin spread across the intruder's face. "Stay right there," the man said, his voice low and menacing, as he stepped closer. For a split second, Reed was frozen with fear. His mind raced. How did this man get in? Why was he here? But instincts kicked in, and Reed bolted toward the nearest window. Without thinking, he threw it open and leaped out into the cold night air, cutting his hands on the window frame in his haste. He hit the ground hard, rolling to his feet, and took off running into the woods behind the house. His heart pounded as he sprinted through the trees, branches whipping at his face and arms. He fumbled for his phone and, with shaking hands, dialed 911. Breathless, he explained what had happened as he crouched behind a large tree, eyes darting toward the house, half expecting the man to appear behind him. When the police finally arrived, they searched the house thoroughly, but the man was gone. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks. It was as if the intruder had never been there. The officers found nothing missing, though Reed insisted the man had been rummaging through his things. One of the officers, a stout man with kind eyes, patted Reed on the shoulder. "You're lucky you got out when you did," he said. "We've had reports of break-ins around this area. Usually, no one's home, but you never know what these people are capable of." Reed nodded, feeling the weight of his own breath for the first time since the ordeal began. The adrenaline had worn off, and all that remained was a deep, bone-chilling exhaustion. The police offered to station a patrol car outside for the night, but Reed declined. He wasn't staying another minute in that house. The next morning, Reed packed his things and left the neighborhood without looking back. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt suffocating, like the trees themselves were watching him. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the shadows, that man was still watching, still waiting. And Reed knew without a doubt that he would never rent a secluded Airbnb again. It was a stormy October night when Carl Lawson found himself driving through the remote backroads of Pennsylvania. The road stretched on endlessly, bordered by thick, shadowy trees, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Carl had been driving for hours, his eyelids heavy, but the rain hitting his windshield in violent bursts kept him alert. He glanced at the fuel gauge, and his heart sank. The needle hovered dangerously close to empty. "I should have filled up earlier," he muttered, scolding himself. With no choice but to find a gas station soon, he gripped the wheel and drove on, hoping to stumble upon some late-night pit stop. As the minutes ticked by, his hopes dimmed. The rain was relentless now, drumming against the car like angry fingers. His GPS had lost signal miles back, and he hadn't seen another car for what felt like hours. Just as he began to wonder if he was truly lost, a flicker of light appeared up ahead, barely visible through the sheets of rain. He squinted, and there it was. A gas station. It looked ancient, the kind of place you might see in an old horror film. The pumps were rusted, their paint peeling away in long strips. Behind the pump stood a small building, its windows dark except for a faint glow in the back. Relieved but cautious, Carl pulled in. The rain pounded the roof of his car as he stepped out, pulling his jacket tight against the cold wind. He approached the pumps, hoping at least one might work, but both had large, handwritten signs taped to them. Out of order. Carl cursed under his breath and glanced toward the building, seeing the dim light still glowing in the back. He hesitated, but the cold and the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere pushed him forward. He reached the door, which creaked ominously as he opened it. Inside, the place was a wreck. The shelves were overturned and dust coated every surface. It didn't look like anyone had set foot in there for years. Yet, that eerie lamp in the back flickered weakly, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. "Hello?" Carl called out, his voice shaky. The air was thick, heavy with a strange smell he couldn't place. There was no answer. The silence unnerved him. Something about this place felt wrong, deeply wrong. He quickly decided he wasn't going to stick around to find out what. He turned and rushed back outside, his heart racing. As he approached his car, Carl's stomach dropped. A figure was standing by the driver's side door. A man, tall and thin, with a hood pulled low over his face. The man was still, too still, as if waiting for him. "Can I help you?" Carl asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had no idea where the words came from. His brain screamed at him to run. The man didn't answer. His head tilted slightly, and Carl felt a chill crawl down his spine. Then, without warning, Carl heard rapid footsteps behind him. He spun around just in time to see another man. This one, bulkier, wild-eyed, charging at him from the gas station's door. Carl's instincts kicked in. He bolted for the car, shoving the thin man aside with all his strength. His hands fumbled with the keys as his pursuer closed in, but he managed to wrench the door open, dive inside, and slam it shut. The bulkier man threw himself at the car, his face twisted in rage, slamming his fists against the window. Carl didn't waste a second. He started the engine, the tires screeching as he sped off, spraying mud and rainwater in his wake. His heart pounded in his chest as he flew down the dark road, the gas gauge forgotten in his panic. He didn't stop until he was miles away, until the rain had eased and the adrenaline in his veins began to ebb. It wasn't until the next day, when he reached the next town and finally found a working gas station, that he allowed himself to process what had happened. As he filled his tank, he walked around to inspect the car and froze. A long, deep scratch marred the side of his vehicle, right where the thin man had been standing. It looked like it had been made by a knife. Shaken, Carl asked the station attendant about the old place in the woods. The man frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. "That station's been abandoned for over 10 years, the attendant said. "Nobody's been out there since it closed down after the owner disappeared." Carl swallowed hard. He didn't say a word as he paid and drove away, his mind replaying the events of the night before. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped something far worse than he realized, and the scratch on his car was proof that he hadn't imagined any of it. As he left the town behind, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those two figures standing there, watching him disappear into the night.